The Wyoming sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the prairie dust to powder that rose with every gust of wind and coated everything's skin clothes, the inside of your mouth, with a fine layer of grit that tasted of ancient stone and desperation. Catherine Hale. Kate, to the handful of souls who still bothered speaking her name without adding, "that poor woman," or "stubborn fool," after it knelt beside the irrigation ditch that ran along the eastern edge of her property, her hands raw and bleeding as she pried rocks from the crumbling earthwork, with fingers that had long since forgotten what it meant to be soft. The water that trickled through the channel was more than liquid. It was survival itself at the thin line between a functioning ranch and 160 acres of worthless dust. Every drop that leaked through cracks in the dried mud and disappeared into the thirsty ground was another day closer to losing everything Thomas had worked for, everything they'd built together in the 5 years before a wagon axle had snapped and crushed him beneath 2,000 pounds of wood and iron. She was 27 years old and felt twice that age. 2 years as a widow would do that to a woman, especially when that widowhood came with a generous helping of suspicion from neighbors, isolation from former friends, the certain knowledge that her husband's death had been no accident. The county sheriff had called it tragic misfortune. Kate called it murder, though she'd learned quickly that saying so out loud only earned her pitying looks and advice to move on from people who'd never had to bury someone they loved in ground that was still frozen from winter. Thomas had been dead for 23 months, 1 week and 4 days. Kate knew because she'd counted every single one of them, marked them off in her mind like a prisoner scratching lines on a cell wall. 23 months since she'd knelt in the mud beside an overturned wagon and felt his hand go cold in hers while he struggled to draw breath through punctured lungs. 23 months since she'd watched the light fade from his eyes and known with terrible certainty that she was alone in a territory where being alone and female meant you were prey. She straightened now, pressing one muddy hand to the small of her back, where the muscles screamed in protest, and surveyed her domain with the grim satisfaction of someone who'd held on to something against long odds and longer nights. The ranch house was a low-slung affair of weathered timber and sod roof built into the hillside for protection against the winter winds that came howling down from the mountains like wolves looking for something to tear apart. The barn leaned slightly to the east, had been leaning that way since the spring storms 3 years back, but the structure was still sound, still standing. The corral fence needed mending in at least 3 places, maybe 4, if she was being honest with herself. The chicken coop was holding together with prayers and baling wire. And the spring, the cold, clear spring that bubbled up from limestone rock at the base of the western ridge, like a gift from a god. Kate had stopped believing in, around the same time they'd lowered Thomas into the ground, still flowed pure and strong and life-giving. That spring was why Thomas was dead. Kate was as certain of that as she was of her own name. Mortimer Pike wanted it. Had wanted it for years, ever since he'd arrived in the territory with money from back east and ambitions that stretched wider than the horizon. Pike owned the Broken Crown Ranch, which sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land to the northland that produced the finest beef cattle this side of the Rockies when there was water to be had. But 5,000 acres without reliable water was just 5,000 acres of dust and sun-bleached bones when the drought came, as it had for 3 summers running, turning the prairie grass brown and brittle and the river to a trickle that couldn't sustain Pike's growing herds. Pike had made Thomas an offer 18 months before the accident. A generous offer, he'd said. More than fair. Enough money to buy a new spread somewhere else, somewhere with less wind and more rain, and neighbors who didn't look at you sideways. Thomas had refused. The spring belonged to the Hales. Thomas's father had homesteaded this land, had built the original cabin with his own hands, had died defending it during a blizzard that had lasted 3 days and taken 4 lives in the valley. The spring stayed with the family. That was the end of the discussion. 3 weeks later, Thomas's wagon had rolled over him on a road he'd traveled 1,000 times, a road that was flat and wide and easy on a day that was clear and calm. The blacksmith had inspected the axle just 2 days before and pronounced it sound as bedrock. But when they'd pulled the wreckage apart, the axle had been sawed halfway through, cut so carefully that it would hold under normal weight, but snap like a dry twig under stress. The county sheriff, a man named Dawson, who spent more time in Pike's pocket than in his own office, had looked at the evidence, shrugged, and written accidental death in his report. When Kate had protested, when she'd shown him the saw marks, when she'd all but screamed that her husband had been murdered, Dawson had patted her hand like she was a child and suggested that grief was making her see things that weren't there. Pike had made Kate an offer 2-3 months after the funeral. The same generous terms, he'd said. Maybe even better given her circumstances. A widow alone couldn't run a ranch, couldn't manage the livestock and the land and the endless work. It would be a mercy to sell, really. A chance to start fresh somewhere easier. Kate had met him at the property line with Thomas's Winchester rifle cradled in her arms and her finger resting light on the trigger. She'd told him in words of one syllable that she would die before she'd sell him so much as a cup of dirt from her land. Pike had smiled a thin, cold expression that never reached his eyes, tipped his expensive hat, and ridden away on his expensive horse. But his man, Captain Elias Stroud, had stayed behind. Stroud called himself a captain, wore a militia uniform with brass buttons, and a saber at his hip, but everyone in the territory knew he was nothing more than Pike's hired gun, with a coat of legal paint slapped over his crimes. He'd looked Kate up and down with pale eyes that made her skin crawl, eyes like chips of January ice that had never known warmth or mercy. Accidents happen, Mrs. Hale. Stroud had said, his voice soft and pleasant and absolutely terrifying, especially to folks who don't know when to accept a generous offer. Your husband didn't know. I'd hate to see you make the same mistake. That had been 18 months ago. Since then, Kate had learned to sleep with one eye open and the Winchester within arm's reach. She'd learned to check her fences every morning, for cuts her barn, for signs of tampering her food, for anything that tasted wrong. She'd learned which of her neighbors were still friendly and which had been bought or frightened into silence. She'd learned that the law, such as it was in this corner of Wyoming territory, belonged to whoever had the most money and the least conscience. She'd also learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, more stubborn than was probably wise, and absolutely unwilling to let Thomas's murderers win. Kate bent back to her work, now jamming another stone into the crumbling ditch wall, when she heard it, the unmistakable thunder of hoofbeats coming fast from the north, multiple horses being pushed hard. The sound carried clear across the prairie in the still afternoon air, a warning that arrived 30 seconds before the danger itself. She looked up, shading her eyes against the brutal glare of the sun. 3 riders, maybe 4, still too far away to make out details, but close enough to tell they were riding with purpose. As they drew closer, she could make out the blue coats and brass buttons that marked them as Militia Stroud's men, and her pulse kicked up into her throat like a frightened bird. Kate stood slowly, deliberately wiping her muddy hands on the work trousers she'd taken to wearing. She'd stopped bothering with skirts for ranch work about a year ago, after the 3rd time she'd nearly broken her neck trying to chase down a spooked horse, while tangled in petticoats and propriety be damned. She walked toward the house with measured steps, keeping her movements calm and unhurried, even though everything in her screamed to run. The rifle was propped just inside the door, loaded and ready. If she could reach it before they reached her, if she could get her hands on it and her back against something solid. The riders thundered into her yard in a boiling cloud of dust and flying grit, their horses lathered and blowing hard foam dripping from bits. Kate recognized 2 of them immediately. Quiet Tom Brennan, who had the decency to look uncomfortable when he was doing Stroud's dirty work, and scar-faced Jim Holloway, who didn't have the decency to look anything other than mean. The 3rd was a younger man. She didn't recognize, barely old enough to shave, with nervous hands and eyes that wouldn't stay still. Mrs. Hale. Tom called, touching the brim of his hat, in a gesture that might have been respectful in any other context. "We're looking for a fugitive. Indian. Tall, dangerous. You seen anyone like that around here?" Kate's mind raced, even as her face stayed calm. She hadn't seen anyone, hadn't had a visitor of any kind in 3 weeks. But the fact that Stroud's men were asking meant someone was running, and anyone running from these particular men probably had excellent reasons. "I've seen plenty of dangerous men lately." She said, her voice level, and carrying just enough edge to let them know she wasn't frightened. Most of them wearing badges they didn't earn and carrying authority they don't deserve. Jim spat a stream of tobacco juice into her yard, and the brown spittle landing inches from her boot. "Watch your mouth, woman. We're here on official business, duly authorized by Captain Stroud and Mr. Pike. You want to obstruct the law, that's a crime." "Official business," Kate repeated, letting the skepticism show in her voice. "Like when you officially ran the Johnson family off their claim last month, or when you officially burned out the Morales family for not paying your protection money, that kind of official." The young rider's hand drifted toward the revolver at his hip, his face flushing red. Tom reached out and caught his wrist, shaking his head. "We don't have time for this, Danny. The savage went to ground somewhere around here, can't have gotten far with that wound. We'll be searching your property, Mrs. Hale, with or without your permission. You have a warrant?" Kate asked, though she already knew the answer. "Don't need a warrant for a fugitive hunt," Jim said. He swung down from his horse, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, in a gesture that was pure threat. "Now you can step aside peaceful-like, or we can move you aside. Your choice, but choose quick." Kate's hand inched toward the doorframe, toward where the rifle waited just out of sight. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples, could taste copper on her tongue. If she could just get her fingers around the stock, if she could bring it up fast enough, a gunshot cracked across the yard, sharp and sudden, as a lightning strike, and all 4 of them froze. The shot hadn't come from any of them. Kate's eyes darted to the barn, where a thin wisp of smoke drifted lazily from the darkness of the hayloft window, already dissipating in the breeze. "Next one won't be a warning," a voice called from the shadows. It was deep and rough-shaped around English words, with an accent that spoke of another language, learned first, another way of seeing the world. "Leave the woman. Leave now, or I start shooting to kill." The militiamen's horses shied and danced, picking up on the sudden tension. Jim yanked his pistol free, scanning the barn with narrowed eyes. "Show yourself, you coward. Come out where we can see you." "You want to see me?" The voice called back, and there was something in it now that raised the hairs on Kate's neck, not fear exactly, but recognition of danger and the same instinct that made deer freeze when they caught the scent of a mountain lion. "Then come and look. But your friends will be carrying what's left of you out in pieces." Tom's jaw tightened. He leaned toward Jim, speaking low, but urgent. "He's got high ground and cover. We're sitting in the open like targets at a turkey shoot. This is foolish, Jim. We need to fall back and get reinforcements. We can't just... We fall back." Tom said, his voice harder now, carrying the authority of someone who'd actually seen combat instead of just playing at soldier. "We report to Captain Stroud, let him decide how to handle this. That's the smart play." Jim looked like he wanted to argue. His face flushed with anger and something that might have been embarrassment. But Tom was already turning his horse, and after a long, tense moment, Jim followed suit. Danny, the young one, looked almost relieved as he wheeled his mount around. They galloped out of the yard, throwing up another cloud of dust, leaving Kate standing alone with her heart still racing and her hands shaking with the adrenaline she hadn't let show. She waited until the hoofbeats faded completely, until the dust began to settle, and the prairie silence returned. Then she turned slowly toward the barn. "You can come out now," she called, pitching her voice to Carrie. They're gone. For now. Silence. Long enough that Kate began to wonder if she'd imagined the whole thing, if the heat and stress had finally broken something in her mind. Then slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows of the barn. Not from the hayloft where the shot had come from, but from the ground level from behind a stack of hay bales near the back wall. He was Arapaho, she thought, though she'd never been particularly good at distinguishing between the tribes. Tall didn't begin to describe him. He was massive, broad-shouldered, and powerful in a way that made her feel small even from 20 feet away. His face was all hard planes and sharp angles, bronze skin pulled tight over high cheekbones, and a strong jaw. His hair was long and dark, tied back with a strip of leather. He wore buckskin trousers and a shirt that had once been white but was now torn and stained dark with blood across the left side. His eyes, when they met hers, were dark and wary, the eyes of something wild that had learned to be cautious around humans. He held a rifle, old but well-maintained, pointed at the ground, but his finger was still near the trigger. "You're hurt," Kate said, because it was obvious and because someone needed to say something to break the tension. He said nothing, just watched her with that unblinking intensity that made her think of the wolves that sometimes came down from the mountains in the dead of winter. Kate weighed her options in the space of 3 heartbeats. She could turn him in curry favor with Stroud, and Pike maybe buy herself some breathing room and some time. Or she could do what every instinct in her body was screaming at her to do, help someone who just saved her from being roughed up or worse by Stroud's thugs. When she really thought about it, there wasn't much of a choice at all. "Come inside," she said, making her voice as calm and practical as she could. "I'll get you patched up. Then you're going to tell me exactly why Stroud wants you dead, and you're going to tell me the truth because I don't have time or patience for lies. We clear?" He hesitated, his hand pressed to the wound at his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "Why do you help me? You do not know me." "No," Kate agreed. "But I know Stroud, and I know Pike. And anyone they want dead badly enough to chase across half the territory is probably someone worth keeping alive. Now, are you coming, or are you going to stand there bleeding until you pass out, and I have to drag you inside? Because I'll tell you right now, you're too big for me to move if you're unconscious." After a long moment, long enough that Kate wondered if he was going to bolt back into the wilderness, he nodded once and followed her into the house. His name was Sharp Nose, and he'd been framed for murder. Kate cleaned his wound while he told her the story, her hands steady, despite the way her stomach turned at the sight of torn flesh and exposed muscle. The bullet had carved a deep furrow across his ribs, close enough to be deadly serious, but far enough from anything vital that he'd live if infection didn't set in. She'd learned battlefield medicine from necessity. Out here, you either learned to stitch wounds and set bones, or you watched people die from injuries that would have been minor inconveniences in a place with doctors and hospitals. "Hold still," she said, threading her needle with practiced efficiency. "This is going to hurt. Pain I can handle," Sharp Nose said through gritted teeth. "Injustice is harder to bear." She started stitching her movements, quick and precise. "Tell me about the injustice." He drew a slow breath, then began. 2 days ago, a white freighter was found dead on the road to Medicine Bow. Shot in the back, his wagon looted. I was seen in the area that morning. I had been hunting, had traded some pelts at the trading post. When the body was discovered, Captain Stroud declared me guilty. No trial, no questions. Just guilt. "What evidence did he have?" Kate asked, tying off one stitch and starting another. "None. Only that I was there. Only that I am Arapaho." His voice was flat empty of self-pity, but heavy with a weariness that Kate recognized in her own soul. "I tried to surrender peacefully to explain that I had nothing to do with this death. Stroud would not listen. His men opened fire. I ran. Kate worked in silence for a moment, processing this. Why would Stroud frame you? What does he gain? Sharp Nose was quiet while she finished another stitch. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. My people, we have a camp near the river on land that was promised to us by treaty. Good land with water and grass. But now Pike wants that land. He wants us gone. If I am a murderer, if I am a threat, he has excuse to bring soldiers to drive my people away. Maybe to kill them. Kate's hands stilled for a moment as the pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Pike needed access to the river for his cattle. The Arapaho camp was in the way. But even out here, even in the lawless territories, there were limits to what the powerful could do without consequences. You couldn't just attack a peaceful Indian camp without cause. There were federal laws, treaties, the threat of intervention from the Army or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But if the Arapaho were harboring a murderer, if they refused to turn him over, if they seemed like a threat to white settlers. Pike's behind this, she said. It wasn't a question. Pike, Stroud, they work together. They are two hands of the same body. Sharp Nose sucked in a sharp breath as she pulled the thread tight. They take what they want. They kill who stands in their way, and they use the law as a weapon. Yeah, Kate said softly, finishing the last stitch and tying it off. I know. She cleaned the wound again, packed it with a poultice made from yarrow and honey, her mother's recipe passed down from a grandmother who'd been a field medic in the war between the states. Then she wrapped it with clean linen torn from one of her last good sheets, the ones she'd been saving for some nebulous future occasion that would probably never come. When she was done, she sat back and studied him. Up close, with the immediate danger past and her adrenaline fading, she could see details she'd missed before. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30, give or take. There were scars on his arms and chest, old wounds that spoke of a hard life. But his hands, when they weren't pressed against bleeding flesh, moved with surprising delicacy. The hands of someone who knew how to be gentle as well as violent. You can't stay here, she said, though the words felt like a betrayal, even as she spoke them. Stroud will be back probably with more men. If they find you here, they'll kill us both. I know. Sharp Nose met her eyes. I should return to my people. But if I do, Stroud will follow. Then he will have his excuse. Many will die, women, children, elders, all because of lies. He straightened, wincing at the pull on his stitches. I will not run. I will stay. I will find proof of my innocence. Or I will die trying. Kate wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that dying for a principle was noble, but ultimately pointless. But she saw the set of his jaw, the determination in his eyes, and recognized something of herself in him. She'd worn that same expression in the mirror every morning for the past 2 years, ever since she'd decided she would rather die defending her land than sell it to her husband's murderer. Then we'd better find that proof, she said. And we'd better find it fast, because Stroud won't wait long to make his next move. They came back the next morning, and this time they brought an army. Kate woke to the sound of hoofbeats, not 3 horses this time, but at least a dozen, maybe more. She threw off her blanket, grabbed the Winchester, and ran to the window. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could see them coming up the road in a long column, blue coats and brass buttons, gleaming horses, moving at a steady trot that ate up the distance between threat and reality. She ran to the barn, her bare feet slapping against the cold ground. Sharp Nose was already awake, already armed, his rifle in his hands, and his face set in the kind of calm that came before violence. They're coming, Kate said, her breath coming hard. A lot of them, at least a dozen. Sharp Nose nodded, checking his ammunition with quick, efficient movements. You should tell them I forced you. Tell them I held you hostage, threatened to kill you if you did not help me. They might believe it. They might let you live." "And then what?" Kate demanded. "They hang you for a crime you didn't commit, and I go back to waiting for Pike to take my land, go back to sleeping with one eye open and wondering when the next accident will happen." She shook her head fiercely. "No. We stand together, or we don't stand at all." Before Sharpnose could respond, the sound of hoofbeats filled the yard and then fell silent. Kate walked out to meet them, her head high and her rifle cradled in her arms, like she was just another rancher checking on unexpected visitors, and not a woman facing down her husband's killers, with nothing but stubbornness and rage to keep her standing. Captain Elias Stroud sat at the head of the column, his uniform immaculate despite the dust, every button polished and every crease sharp enough to cut. He was a lean man with a narrow face and cold, pale eyes that reminded Kate of a snake she'd once found in her chicken coop. Beautiful in its way, perfectly designed for killing and absolutely without mercy. Behind him rode a mix of his regular men, and at least 6 she didn't recognize, hired guns, most likely brought in from out of territory to make sure the job got done. And riding beside Stroud, looking pleased as a cat in a creamery, was Mortimer Pike himself. Pike was portly in the way of men who'd grown prosperous, with shrewd eyes set in a face that was starting to go soft around the edges. He wore an expensive suit that looked ridiculous out here in the dust and wind, but he wore it like armor, like a statement of superiority. He'd come, Kate realized, to watch. To see his enemy brought low, to savor his victory. "Mrs. Hale." Stroud said, his voice smooth and practiced. "I believe you're harboring a fugitive from justice. I'm going to have to insist you surrender him immediately." "What fugitive?" Kate asked, keeping her voice level. "Don't play games with me, woman. The savage you sheltered yesterday, the murderer. We know he's here." "Do you have proof he's a fugitive?" Kate asked. "Or are you just making assumptions because he's Indian?" Stroud's expression hardened the pleasant mask, slipping just enough to show the cruelty underneath. "He's wanted for the murder of Samuel Crenshaw, a white man, and a respected member of our community. We have a witness who saw him near the body." "What witness? Let me hear what they have to say." "That's none of your concern, Mrs. Hale. All you need to know is that we have legal authority to apprehend this fugitive, and you are currently obstructing justice." Stroud leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "You're a smart woman. Smarter than your husband was, I think. He didn't know when to back down, and look where it got him. Don't make the same mistake." The threat was clear, naked, and unambiguous. Kate felt rage flood through her hot and fierce enough to burn away the last traces of fear. "You killed him," she said. "You or your men. You sawed through his wagon axle, and you killed him because he wouldn't sell you his land." Stroud's smile was cold and reptilian. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Your husband died in an unfortunate accident. The county sheriff investigated thoroughly and found no evidence of foul play. The county sheriff is in Pike's pocket." "Careful, Mrs. Hale." Pike spoke for the first time, his voice soft and dangerous. "You're making very serious accusations. Accusations that could land you in prison for slander or worse." Kate opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another sound cut across the morning air, the rattle of wagon wheels on the rough road coming fast. Everyone turned to look. One turned to... A battered buckboard was approaching, driven by a man with white hair and a dusty black suit. Kate's heart leaped with recognition and hope. Dr. Frederick Harlan pulled his wagon to a stop at the edge of the yard, seemingly oblivious to the armed standoff he'd just driven into. He climbed down with the careful movements of a man whose joints ached in the morning and walked straight toward Stroud, his medical bag in one hand. "Captain Stroud," he said pleasantly, as if they'd met at a church social rather than in the middle of what was about to become a bloodbath. "What brings you out to Mrs. Hale's ranch with such an impressive escort?" Stroud's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed smooth. "Official militia business, Doctor. Nothing that concerns you." "Oh, but it does concern me," Harlan said, pulling a worn notebook from his pocket and flipping through it with maddening slowness. "You see, I came out here to check on Mrs. Hale. She sent word yesterday that she had an injured man who needed medical attention, an Indian gentleman with a gunshot wound. Naturally, I came as quickly as I could manage." Kate wanted to hug the old man. He was lying through his teeth she'd sent no such message, and doing it with perfect sincerity. "That man is a fugitive wanted for murder." Stroud said, his voice tight. "Is he?" Harlan looked genuinely surprised. "How odd. Because I have here a statement from Chester Mills. You know Chester runs the general store in Medicine Bow, stating that he saw Samuel Crenshaw alive and well at the evening of the supposed murder, drinking at the Red Dog Saloon with 3 other men. That was a full 6 hours after the time you claimed the murder occurred, Captain." Stroud's face went very still, very cold. "Mills is mistaken." "Perhaps, but I also have statements from 4 other witnesses who saw Crenshaw that same evening, all placing the time of death well after your official report claims it happened." Harlan pulled out another paper, studying it with academic interest. "I also have a note from the undertaker, good man, very detail-oriented, who observed signs consistent with corrosive sublimate mercuric chloride poisoning, rather than a gunshot, severe gastric corrosion, and tissue discoloration. He preserved stomach contents. Upon examination, I found further indications of poisoning." "This is absurd," Pike interjected, his face flushing. "The man was shot in the back. There were witnesses." "Were there?" Harlan looked at him with mild curiosity. "Could you name them for me? I'd very much like to include their testimony in my report to the territorial governor." The silence stretched out taut as a rope about to snap. Kate could see Stroud's hand hovering near his revolver, could see Pike's face growing redder with rage. But they were trapped, she realized. Harlan had called their bluff in front of a dozen witnesses, and they couldn't kill him without proving every word he'd said was true. Finally, Stroud jerked his horse's head around. "This isn't over, Doctor. Not by a long shot. And Mrs. Hale, you've made a very serious mistake today. Very serious indeed." He wheeled his horse and rode off, Pike and the hired guns following. But Kate noticed that several of the militiamen, including Quiet Tom, looked deeply uncomfortable as they rode away. When they were gone, Kate lowered her rifle with shaking hands. Harlan turned to her, his expression grave. "You've made powerful enemies, Kate," he said quietly. "I made those enemies 2 years ago when I refused to let them steal what's mine." Kate replied. She looked at the old doctor, this man who just saved their lives with nothing but quick thinking and outrageous lies. "But thank you. You probably just saved both our lives. Probably only bought you a little time," Harlan said. He pulled another paper from his coat, a real one this time, and handed it to her. "This is what I actually came to give you. A friend of mine in the territorial capital sent it. It's a bill of sale for lumber and materials for constructing a dam. Purchased 3 weeks before your husband died. Guess who bought them?" Kate unfolded the paper with trembling hands. At the bottom, in neat script, was a signature she recognized, Mortimer Pike. He was going to dam the river? She whispered, the pieces falling into place. "Cut off my spring at the source. Thomas must have found out. And when he confronted Pike..." "No proof of that," Harlan said quickly. "Not proof that would hold up in court. But yes, that's my suspicion. Your husband was a good man, Kate. He deserved better than what he got." Kate looked up, her jaw set. "Then we need to find proof, Real proof. Something that will stick. Because Stroud was right about one thing, this isn't over. Not until Pike and Stroud answer for what they've done. Harlan nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. Because I think I know where to start looking. They gathered in Kate's kitchen that night. Kate Sharpnose and Dr. Harlan huddled around the scarred wooden table by the light of 2 oil lamps. Between them lay a map of the territory marked with Harlan's careful annotations. Pike keeps meticulous records, Harlan said, tapping the map with one gnarled finger. Has to with an operation as large as his. Inventory, payrolls, bribes, business expenses, all carefully documented. A man like Pike, he needs to know where every dollar goes. Where does he keep these records? Kate asked. His ranch house would be the obvious place. But it's guarded day and night, and Pike's not fool enough to leave incriminating evidence where just anyone might stumble across it. Harlan traced a line on the map to a point marked with an X. There's another possibility, though. The old Sourjack mine. Sharpnose leaned forward, studying the map. Mine. Abandoned gold mine about 5 miles north of here, Kate explained. Played out 20 years ago, but I've seen lights there at night sometimes, and wagon tracks leading in. Thomas thought Pike was using it as a storehouse for something he didn't want people to see. Something like stolen army weapons, Harlan said quietly. I've heard rumors, nothing I could prove, but persistent rumors that Pike's been trafficking in military supplies. Rifles, ammunition, even a few small artillery pieces. Selling them to whoever can pay no questions asked. Kate felt ice settle in her stomach. If he's arming hostile forces, that's treason. That's a hanging offense. It is, which is why he'd keep very careful records in a place where they'd be safe from casual discovery, but accessible when he needed them. Harlan looked at both of them. If we could find those records, find proof of what Pike and Stroud have done, we could bring this to a federal judge. Someone outside their sphere of influence. It's a trap, Sharpnose said flatly. They know we will look for proof. They will be waiting. Possibly, Harlan admitted. But it's the only lead we have. And Judge Ambrose Carter is due in Medicine Bow next week for the circuit court. If we can get evidence to him, real documented evidence, he has the authority to issue federal warrants for Pike and Stroud's arrest. A week is a long time, Kate said quietly. Stroud won't wait that long to come after us, especially now that you've embarrassed him in front of his men. No, he won't, Harlan agreed. Which is why you need to move quickly. Get in, find what you need, and get out. I'll take copies to Medicine Bow, get them into safe hands. If something happens to you, at least the truth will survive. Kate looked at Sharpnose. In the lamplight, his face was all sharp angles and deep shadows, but his eyes were steady and clear. We go tonight, she said, before they have time to set up whatever trap they're planning. Then we go together, Sharpnose said, and we do not fail. They left 2 hours after midnight, riding double on Kate's sturdy bay mare. Sharpnose's wound was still fresh enough that riding alone would have been foolish, and they couldn't risk taking 2 horses and leaving one at the mine as evidence. They moved slowly through the darkness, following old mining roads that were barely visible in the starlight, Kate navigating by memory and instinct, while Sharpnose kept watch for any signs of pursuit. The ride took nearly 3 hours, following switchbacks up into the foothills. The night was cold at this elevation, and Kate found herself grateful for Sharpnose's warmth at her back, for the solid strength of his arms around her waist as they rode. She tried not to think about how natural it felt, how right. There were more important things to worry about. The Sourjack mine entrance was a black mouth in the hillside, half hidden by scrub brush and the twisted remnants of old mining equipment. Kate dismounted, first her legs stiff from the long ride, and led the mare into cover behind a rocky outcrop. Sharp Nose followed, moving carefully to avoid pulling his stitches. "Wait here," Kate whispered. "I'll scout ahead, make sure." Sharp Nose shook his head. "We go together. You do not go alone into danger." Kate wanted to argue, but the set of his jaw told her it would be pointless. Besides, he was right. Splitting up was how people died in situations like this. She lit a small lantern she'd brought, keeping the flame low, and led the way into the mine. The air inside was cool and damp, smelling of old rock and stale water and something else, something chemical and sharp that made her nose wrinkle. The main tunnel stretched ahead, supported by ancient timbers that creaked ominously with every breath of wind from outside. They moved slowly, Kate, testing each step before committing her weight. The floor was uneven, littered with rocks and old tools, and the occasional patch of standing water that reflected their lamplight in strange, distorted patterns. Behind her, Sharp Nose moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. 50 yards in the tunnel branched. Kate hesitated, trying to remember which way Thomas had gone the one time he'd taken her inside years ago when they'd first arrived in the territory and were exploring their new home. Left, she thought. Or was it right? Sharp Nose touched her shoulder, then pointed silently to the left tunnel. In the dirt, barely visible in the lamplight, were fresh boot prints and the deep grooves of wagon wheels. Someone had been here recently, and they'd been hauling something heavy. They followed the tracks deeper into the mine, the tunnel sloping gradually downward. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and Kate had to fight the urge to turn and run back to the surface, back to open sky and clean air. The walls seemed to press in closer with every step, the darkness beyond their small pool of light absolute and suffocating. Then Sharp Nose held up a hand, and Kate froze. Ahead, faint but unmistakable, was the flicker of lamplight. They crept forward, moving even more slowly now, until they reached a widening in the tunnel. A natural chamber large as a church, lit by 4 lanterns hanging from iron hooks driven into the rock walls. And stacked along the walls, covered with canvas tarps, but clearly visible beneath, were crates. Dozens of them. Maybe more than 100. Kate moved closer, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She lifted the edge of one tarp and read the stenciled letters on the nearest crate, U.S. Army. Property of Fort Laramie. She pried the lid open with her knife, revealing rifles packed in straw, brand new and gleaming with oil. "Sweet mercy," she breathed. "He's stealing military supplies. Weapons, ammunition, enough to arm a small war." Sharp Nose opened another crate, this one full of ammunition boxes. Or enough to make people believe the Arapaho are preparing for war. This is why he framed me. He will claim we stole these weapons that we are planning to attack. The army will come. My people will be slaughtered, and Pike will take the land. Kate felt sick. The scope of Pike's plan was staggering, not just murder and theft, but conspiracy to commit genocide, all in the service of greed. "Where are the records?" she asked, her voice shaking. "There have to be records. Pike's too smart to run an operation like this without documentation." They searched the chamber, moving quickly but carefully. Kate was beginning to think they'd come all this way for nothing when Sharp Nose called her over to a small desk, tucked into an alcove, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. The desk was covered with papers, ledgers, and a locked strongbox. Kate grabbed one of the ledgers and flipped it open, angling it toward the light. It was all there, laid out in meticulous detail, a complete record of stolen military supplies, dates and quantities and destinations. Payments to corrupt officers who looked the other way. Bribes to territorial officials who ensured no investigations were launched. And there, in Pike's own handwriting, a note dated 4 days before Thomas's death. T. Hale becoming a serious problem. Confronted me about the dam project. Knows too much. Stroud will handle it. Make it look accidental. No traces. Kate's hands trembled as she read the words. Proof. Finally, undeniable proof of what she'd known in her bones for 2 years. Thomas had been murdered, and she'd been right all along. Take it, Sharp-Nose said urgently. Take everything we can carry. We need to. He stopped mid-sentence, his head snapping toward the tunnel entrance. In the sudden silence, Kate heard it too. Voices echoing up from the main tunnel. Men coming closer. Move, Sharp-Nose said, grabbing her arm. He pointed to a smaller side tunnel Kate hadn't noticed before, barely visible in the shadows. They ran, Kate clutching the ledger to her chest, Sharp-Nose right behind her. The side tunnel was narrow, so narrow Kate had to turn sideways to fit through in places. She scraped her shoulders on the rough rock, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind them, the voices grew louder. Someone shouted. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. The tunnel ended abruptly at a vertical shaft, an old ventilation chimney, she realized looking up at the circle of stars visible far above. Iron rungs had been driven into the rock wall, creating a crude ladder, but they were old and rusted, and Kate had no idea if they'd hold. Climb. Sharp-Nose said, his voice urgent. Now. Kate tucked the ledger into her shirt, securing it as best she could, and started up. The rungs were slick with moisture and corrosion. 15 feet up, one broke under her weight with a sharp crack. She slipped her fingers, clawing desperately for purchase, her feet kicking at empty air. Sharp-Nose was there, his hand catching her boot, steadying her with his strength, even as his wound screamed in protest. I have you. He said, his voice steady despite the strain. Keep going. Do not look down. Kate climbed, every muscle trembling with effort and fear. The shaft seemed to go on forever, a vertical tunnel of darkness, with only that distant circle of stars to guide her. Her hands were bleeding, her arms shaking so badly, she wasn't sure she could make the next pull. When suddenly she reached the top and hauled herself out onto the hillside. She turned and reached down for Sharp-Nose, gripping his forearm and pulling with everything she had. He came up the last few feet in a surge of strength and determination, and they both collapsed on the rocky ground, gasping for breath. Below them from the shaft came voices and the sound of pursuit. They couldn't stay here. They ran stumbling through the darkness, cutting their feet on sharp stones and tearing their clothes on sagebrush. Kate had lost her sense of direction entirely. All she knew was that they had to get away. Had to survive long enough to get the evidence to someone who could use it. They ran until Kate's lungs were burning and her legs wouldn't carry her anymore. Then Sharp-Nose pulled her into a narrow crevice between two boulders, barely wide enough for them both, and they huddled there in the darkness while the sound of pursuit passed by so close Kate could have reached out and touched the nearest man's boot. When the voices faded and the sound of horses disappeared into the distance, they finally allowed themselves to breathe again. Kate pulled the ledger from her shirt, checking to make sure it was still intact. It was crumpled and stained with sweat, but the writing was still legible. Still proof. We have it, she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. We actually have it. Sharp-Nose nodded, his face pale with pain in the starlight. Kate saw that his wound had reopened, blood seeping through the bandages and staining his shirt dark. But he was alive, and they had the evidence, and that meant they still had a chance. Come on, she said, taking his arm. We need to find the horse and get back to the ranch. Harlan will know what to do with this. They made their way slowly down the hillside, supporting each other, two people who'd come from different worlds, but who were bound together now by shared danger and shared purpose. Kate didn't let herself think about what would happen next, about the storm that was surely coming. Right now, all that mattered was surviving to see the dawn. They reached the ranch as the sun was breaking over the horizon, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. Dr. Harlan met them at the door, his face creased with worry that melted into relief when he saw them. "Thank God," he said, pulling them inside. "I was about to saddle up and come looking for you. What happened? Are you hurt?" Kate thrust the ledger into his hands. "We found it. Everything we need. Pike's been stealing military weapons, planning to frame the Arapaho for the thefts. And there's written proof, that he ordered Thomas killed." Harlan's hands shook as he opened the ledger, his eyes widening as he read. "Sweet, merciful heaven. This is... Kate, this is enough to hang Pike a dozen times over, and Stroud with him." "Can you get it to Judge Carter?" Kate asked. "Before Pike realizes what we have." "I'll leave immediately. But Kate, you need to understand, Pike will know by now that you broke into the mine. He'll know you have the evidence. He'll come for you with everything he has." Harlan looked at Sharp Nose, taking in the fresh blood staining his shirt. "Both of you need to leave. Get out of the territory, find somewhere safe until after the trial." "No," Kate said firmly. "This is my land, my home. I'm not running, not after everything I've fought for." "Then you're going to need help," Harlan said. He looked at Sharp Nose. "Your people. Would they stand with you if you asked?" Sharp Nose was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with tension. "They would. But it would mean war. Many would die on both sides. I swore I would not bring that upon them." "Many will die anyway if Pike isn't stopped," Kate said. She met his eyes. "I won't force you to bring your people into this. That has to be your choice. But I'm staying. This ends here one way or another." Sharp Nose held her gaze, something passing between them in that moment, understanding respect and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. "Then I stay too," he said finally. "We fight together, and I will send word to my uncle to Black Coal. He will decide if our people join this fight." Harlan stood tucking the ledger carefully into his coat. "I'll make copies before I leave, hide them in different locations. If something happens to me, the evidence will still exist." He paused at the door, looking back at them. "You're both brave. Braver than most. But bravery doesn't stop bullets. Be careful. Be smart. And if you get the chance to surrender to end this without more bloodshed, take it. Surrender to Pike means a rope or a bullet," Kate said quietly. "We're past the point of surrender, Doctor. We've been past it for a long time." They came at noon 3 days later. Kate was in the barn when she heard the hoofbeats, not a dozen riders this time, and not 3. More like 50, maybe more, a small army approaching from the north in a cloud of dust that rose like smoke against the bright blue sky. She grabbed her rifle and ran outside. Sharp Nose was already there, standing in the yard with his own weapon, his face set in grim lines. Together, they watched as the force approached, spreading out to encircle the ranch in a maneuver that was clearly military in nature. Stroud led the column with Pike riding at his side. Behind them came militiamen, hired guns, and Kate's stomach turned several men in actual army uniforms. Pike had somehow gotten federal troops involved, had convinced someone that he was acting in the interests of law and order rather than greed and murder. They stopped just outside rifle range. Stroud raised a hand, and a man rode forward carrying a white flag. "Mrs. Hale." The messenger called his voice, carrying clear across the yard. "Captain Stroud and Mr. Pike request a parley. Just the 4 of you in the open. They've agreed to come unarmed if you'll do the same." Kate and Sharp Nose exchanged glances. It was almost certainly a trap. Had to be a trap. But if there was even the slightest chance to buy time to stall until Judge Carter arrived or until help came. "Tell them to come forward." Kate called back, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. Just the two of them. We'll meet them halfway. No weapons. There was a long pause. Then Stroud and Pike dismounted, unbuckled their gun belts with exaggerated care, and walked forward into no man's land between their forces. Kate handed her rifle to Sharp Nose, who set it aside along with his own. Together they walked out to meet their enemies in the dusty yard, the sun beating down mercilessly, and the wind carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "Mrs. Hale," Pike said when they were close enough to speak without shouting. He was trying for his usual smooth charm, but Kate could see the tension in his face, the barely controlled rage in his eyes. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. If we could just sit down and talk this through like reasonable people." "You killed my husband," Kate said flatly, cutting through his words like a knife. "You killed him because he wouldn't sell you his land. You had Stroud saw through his wagon axle and you killed him, and then you tried to cover it up by calling it an accident." Pike's expression hardened. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Mrs. Hale. Your husband died in a tragic accident. The county sheriff investigated thoroughly." "The county sheriff is on your payroll," Kate interrupted. "Just like half the officials in this territory. But I have proof now. Written proof in your own handwriting ordering Thomas's murder. Planning to frame Sharp Nose for crimes he didn't commit. Documenting your theft of military weapons and your conspiracy to start a war with the Arapaho so you can steal their land." The silence that followed was absolute. Kate could see Pike's jaw working, could see Stroud's hand twitching toward his empty holster, could feel the weight of 50 pairs of eyes watching this confrontation play out. "Those are serious accusations," Pike said finally, his voice soft and dangerous. "Accusations you can't possibly prove." "Can't I?" Kate reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper page she'd torn from the ledger before Harlan left with it. "This is a record of payment to Captain Stroud for removing obstacle. Dated 4 days before my husband died. The obstacle was Thomas, wasn't it?" She pulled out another page. "And this is a letter you wrote to a corrupt Army supply officer arranging the theft of weapons from Fort Laramie, which you planned to plant near the Arapaho camp and use as justification for a massacre that would let you take their land." Pike's face had gone completely white. "Where are the originals?" "Somewhere you'll never find them," Kate said. "And copies are already on their way to the territorial capital, to the federal marshal, to Judge Carter, and to 3 different newspapers. You're finished, Pike. You and Stroud both. The only question now is whether you're going to surrender peacefully or whether you're going to make this worse by adding more murders to your list." For a long moment, no one moved. The wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the yard. Kate could feel her heart pounding in her chest, could feel Sharp Nose's presence beside her like a wall of solid strength. Then Pike turned to Stroud and said very quietly, "Kill them both. Kill them now." Stroud reached for his weapon and found empty leather. His eyes widened with shock and rage. "Looking for these," a new voice called. Everyone turned. Dr. Harlan stood at the edge of the yard, holding both Pike's and Stroud's gun belts high above his head. And behind him, emerging from Kate's barn and from behind the house and from the brush along the creek, came people. Dozens of them. Neighbors, townspeople, and at least 30 Arapaho warriors led by a tall, imposing figure that Kate recognized as Black Coal Sharp Nose's uncle and the chief of his band. And walking at the front of the crowd, his silver badge gleaming in the sunlight, was a tall man in a dark suit whom Kate had never seen before, but whose authority was unmistakable. U.S. Marshal James Whitmore. The man said, his voice carrying across the yard, clear and hard to ignore. "I'm placing you under arrest, Mr. Pike Captain Stroud." Charges include murder conspiracy to commit murder, theft of federal property, bribery of government officials, and conspiracy to incite armed conflict between U.S. citizens and tribal nations. You have the right to remain silent, but I'm advising you not to try running. My deputies have this area completely surrounded. Pike's face went from white to purple. This is outrageous. I'm a respected businessman. You have no authority. I have a federal warrant signed by a federal judge based on evidence provided by Dr. Harlan 3 days ago, Whitmore said. And thanks to Mrs. Hale's bravery and Mr. Sharp-Nose's assistance, I now have additional evidence, including Ledger's correspondence and a list of witnesses who are prepared to testify against you. Stroud lunged toward Whitmore. Desperation, overcoming whatever tactical sense he might have possessed. Sharp-Nose moved like lightning, driving the butt of a rifle he'd somehow acquired into Stroud's stomach, dropping the man to his knees and leaving him gasping in the dirt. Pike tried to run, but he made it less than 5 steps before 2 of Whitmore's deputies caught him and brought him down. They cuffed both men with iron shackles, and Kate watched with a satisfaction so fierce it was almost frightening, as her husband's killers were led away in chains. When they were gone, when the crowd had dispersed and Whitmore's men had secured the area, Kate found herself standing alone with Sharp-Nose in the yard, where this had all begun. "It's over," she said, hardly daring to believe it. Sharp-Nose nodded slowly. "One fight is over, but there will be others. There are always others. Then we'll face them together," Kate said. She looked up at him, at this man who had come into her life as a stranger and a fugitive, and had become something far more important. "If you want to stay, if you want to help me rebuild, I know your people need you, and I won't ask you to choose between." Sharp-Nose silenced her by taking her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "I have already chosen," he said quietly. "I choose to stand with you, to help you rebuild what was taken, to protect what we fought to save, if you will have me." Kate felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, healing tears. "Yes," she said. "I'll have you. I'll have you for as long as you're willing to stay." They stood there in the dusty yard, hands clasped, while the sun climbed higher, and the wind sang through the sage, and the spring continued its eternal flow from the limestone rock, bringing life to a land that had seen too much death. The trial took place 4 weeks later in Medicine Bow's courthouse, in the largest chamber the territory had to offer. The room was packed to overflowing with people standing in the aisles and crowding around the windows outside, everyone wanting to witness justice finally being served. Kate testified for 3 days, recounting everything: Thomas's death, of the threats Pike's attempted land, grabbed the theft of military weapons, the conspiracy to frame Sharp-Nose and provoke war with the Arapaho. Sharp-Nose testified too, describing the frame-up, his escape, and what he'd witnessed at the Sourjack mine. Dr. Harlan presented the evidence with methodical precision, his testimony unshakable under cross-examination. Pike's lawyers were expensive, brought in from back east, and they tried every trick they knew. They claimed the ledgers were forgeries. They suggested Kate was mentally unstable, driven mad by grief. They painted Sharp-Nose as a savage who couldn't be trusted. But when Marshal Whitmore produced the actual stolen weapons, still in their crates, and matched them precisely to Pike's records, that defense crumbled into dust. And when Quiet Tom Brennan took the stand, Tom, who'd finally found his conscience after years of doing Stroud's dirty work, and described in detail how Stroud had ordered him to saw through Thomas Hale's wagon, Axel Pike's fate was sealed. Stroud offered a deal for his testimony, turned on Pike with cold efficiency. He admitted everything: the murder of Thomas Hale, the frame-up of Sharp-Nose, the plan to massacre the Arapaho camp, the theft of government supplies. His testimony was detailed and damning, delivered in the same emotionless voice he'd used when threatening Kate in her own yard. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Mortimer Pike was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Captain Elias Stroud was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Kate sat in the courtroom and watched them led away, their faces gray with shock and disbelief that they, the powerful, could be held accountable for their crimes. She felt no joy in it, no savage satisfaction. Just a hollow relief that it was finally, truly over. After the trial, Judge Ambrose Carter called Kate and Sharp-Nose to his chambers. He was an older man, silver-haired and dignified, with keen eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I want you to know that the territorial governor has issued a full and complete pardon for Mr. Sharp-Nose. All charges are dropped, his record cleared. Additionally, the federal government is seizing all of Mr. Pike's assets, and a substantial portion will be paid to you as restitution for your husband's death and for your invaluable assistance in bringing these criminals to justice." "Thank you, Your Honor," Kate said, her voice thick with emotion. Carter turned to Sharp-Nose. "You showed remarkable courage, sir. You could have fled, could have led Captain Stroud and his men on a chase that would have ended in bloodshed. Instead, you chose to stay and fight for justice through the law. That took courage I'm not sure I would have possessed in your position. If there's anything the territorial government can do for you." "There is one thing," Sharp-Nose said. He looked at Kate, something unreadable in his dark eyes. "I would like to stay, to help Mrs. Hale rebuild her ranch and her life, to be part of this community. If she will have me, and if the law will allow it." Carter smiled, the first genuine smile Kate had seen from him. "The law will not only allow it, sir, it will welcome it. We need more men of integrity in this territory. God knows we've had enough of the other kind." 8 months later, the ranch had been transformed. The restitution money from Pike's seized assets had been substantial enough to repair the barn, properly replace the leaning fence posts with new timber, dig 2 additional irrigation ditches, and even build a small bunkhouse that would house hired help when they could afford to bring more workers on. The spring still flowed clear and strong, feeding not just Kate's land, but 3 neighboring farms as well. They'd formed a water cooperative, Kate's idea supported enthusiastically by the other small landholders, that ensured everyone had fair access and a voice in how the resource was managed. It was messy, required constant negotiation, and occasionally devolved into heated arguments. But it worked, and more importantly, it was just. The Arapaho camp had moved closer to town with permission and support from the territorial government. Black Coal had negotiated a treaty that guaranteed his people access to the river, protection from encroachment by settlers, and recognition of their traditional lands. It was an uneasy peace, built on foundations that were still fragile, but it was peace nonetheless. Sharp-Nose had kept his word. He'd stayed working the ranch alongside Kate from dawn until dusk. They'd fallen into an easy partnership built on mutual respect and trust, forged in fire. He'd taught her to track game, to read weather signs in the behavior of animals and the smell of the wind, to move quietly through the wilderness. She'd taught him English, helped him navigate the complexities of white man's law, and custom shared Thomas's books and maps with him. They worked together, ate together, and slowly, carefully began to build something more than partnership. Something neither of them had names for yet, but which felt as real and solid as the ground beneath their feet. It was Sharp-Nose who proposed on an evening in early summer, when the sky was painted in shades of gold and rose, and the air smelled of sage and rain. They were standing by the spring, watching the water bubble up from the limestone rock, when he turned to her and said, "I would like to marry you, if that would be acceptable to you." Kate blinked, startled by his directness, even though she'd been half expecting this conversation for weeks. "That's not much of a proposal." Sharp-Nose looked genuinely puzzled. "No," What else should I say? Well, usually there's something about love or companionship or spending your lives together. I love you, Sharp Nose said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I have loved you since the night you cleaned my wound and offered me refuge when you had every reason to turn me away. I love your courage, your stubbornness, your absolute refusal to yield to those who would break you. I love the way you fight for what is right, even when fighting is dangerous. I love the way you see people, all people, regardless of their skin or their history, as deserving of dignity and justice. He took her hands in his touch gentle despite the calluses and scars. I would be honored to spend my life by your side, if you will have me. I know I am not of your people, that some will never accept us. I know there will be hardship and struggle. But I also know that standing with you is the truest thing I have ever done. So yes, Kate Hale, I am proposing marriage. Will you accept? Kate felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were good tears, the kind that came from joy rather than sorrow. Yes, she said, her voice shaking. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll marry you and stand with you and build a life with you, and I don't care what anyone else thinks about it. Sharp Nose smiled a rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually stoic face into something warm and beautiful. Then he pulled her close and kissed her slow and sweet while the sun set behind them and the spring sang its eternal song. They were married 6 weeks later in a ceremony that blended white and Arapaho traditions in ways that would have been unthinkable just a year before. Dr. Harlan officiated, his voice strong and sure as he spoke the traditional Christian vows. Black Cole offered blessings in his own language, calling on the spirits of earth and sky to protect and guide the union. Half the territories showed up, some out of genuine goodwill and some out of sheer curiosity to witness such an unusual marriage. Kate wore a simple blue dress. She'd never been one for fuss and fancy clothes, and Sharp Nose wore his finest buckskins, decorated with intricate quill work that his sister had spent weeks creating. They exchanged vows of partnership and loyalty, promising to stand together against whatever challenges came, to honor each other's peoples and traditions, to build something new from the ashes of the old. When it was over, when the guests had finally left, and the gifts had been put away, Kate and Sharp Nose stood together on the porch of their house, no longer just hers, but truly theirs, and looked out over their land. The wheat was growing tall and green in the fields. The cattle just a small herd for now, but theirs grazed peacefully in the pasture. The spring flowed eternal, bringing life to earth that had been soaked with too much blood. This is a good life, Sharp Nose said quietly, his arm around Kate's shoulders. Yes, Kate agreed, leaning into his warmth and strength. It is. She thought of Thomas sometimes with love and lingering sadness, but no longer with the consuming grief that had defined her for so long. Thomas would have wanted her to be happy, she knew, would have wanted her to live fully, not just survive. And she was living now, truly living with a man she loved, on land she'd fought for, and one in a community she'd helped build from broken pieces. Justice had been served. Lives had been saved. Two people from different worlds had found each other in the midst of violence and desperation and had chosen to build something beautiful together. Kate Hale, Kate Sharp Nose. Now, though, she'd kept her first husband's name as well, honoring both the past and the future, stood with her husband under the endless Wyoming sky, and knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The spring would keep flowing, the wheat would keep growing, and they would keep standing together come what may.